Okay, welcome back everybody. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about arrays and a single line input. So if you remember from before, we were doing input on separate lines, as in there was just like one letter on one line or one word on one line, and there were like two lines of input. However, quickly you will realize that in the future in S1 questions, sometimes the problems are going to ask you to have multiple input on the same line. For example, we're not going to be attempting to do this question right now. It's a bit difficult, but there's two inputs on one line, if you get what I mean. There's a 0 and there's a 100, and they're supposed to be taken separately. It's not just like one input where it's 0, 1, 0, 0. It's actually 0 and then 100, and they're both their own integers. So we're going to be doing something similar to this, and I'm going to teach you how to tackle just having one line of input instead of multiple lines, and how you can access each line or each word in a single line and treat it like it's its own variable type of thing. So the first thing you want to do is obviously get input, and before it was something like this. We would do in and then we put input, and then if we wanted to, we can convert it into an integer. However, today our integer, or whatever our input is, it's not going to be straightforward like 5 or blue or something. It's going to be something like a number, and then it's going to be a word. So we can't exactly int this entire thing, because when you go around and input 5 and blue, there's no way to make blue an integer. Similarly, you can't make it a string or a double or anything really. So to combat this issue, you have to use a function in Python specifically called split. And basically what this does, it's going to split whatever your input is into individual data that you can actually access. Now, I'm not sure what language you may be using when doing competitive programming, but almost every language has something similar to this. If you can't find it in Java or something, feel free to always follow along with Python. So when you split a single line input that has multiple different words or numbers in it, basically what you're doing is, and for example, if we take the example of 5 and blue, you're basically allowed to access each of these on its own, and you can reference them as in variables by yourself. How do you do this? Well, right now we have that splitted up input in the variable n. Now for the time being, I'm going to call n line for now. We're just going to call it the variable line. It can be anything you want, but just to explain it to you guys, I'm going to call it line so it looks a bit better. So if we wanted to reference the 5, like the number 5, this is what we would have to do. We'd have to type in line the variable, but since we don't want the blue part, we just want the 5, we use these square brackets, and then we put the number 0. Basically what this does is you're telling the computer to go to the variable line, but since it's a split up variable line, there's multiple pieces to it, you want to access the first piece, and in programming it usually starts at the number 0 instead of 1. So the 0 over here is what we call an index. So the 5 is sitting at the 0 position, and the blue is sitting at the 1 position. So when you do line 0, this is already equal to 5. When you want to access the blue, you have to do line 1. If we had more lines, if we decided to add like my name on the third line, this would be the second index. That's what it's called, indexes. So the 0 index, the first index, and the second index. And that's how you call specific variables or specific data by their indexes, like this. So this is equal to 5, this is equal to blue, and this is equal to my name. So you might be wondering now, well, how exactly do you manipulate the data, or what do you do with this information? Well, let's try to create a program where we first have a number and then we have a color. And basically what happens is if you put 4 blue, the letter or the word blue is repeated 4 times. If it's 5 red, then the word red is repeated 5 times. So nothing too fancy, and really all what you'd have to do is, once again, you convert something to an int, and this would be the line 0, and this is going to be the amount of repeats we have. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, we're going to need some sort of loop, right? We could, have the for loop where you do for I in range. From before we used to do for I in range n. In this situation, we're going to be doing for I in range int line 0, as this thing over here is basically what that is here. So if the first letter or the first input is 3, well then basically this whole thing is going to be replaced with basically the number 3. That's basically what this program is doing right now. If I decided to make it 6, then this number is basically 6 because you're accessing the first number of that line. Alright, so hopefully this isn't too confusing for you guys. Like I said, we're just going to pretend that the input that I put in is 6 in red, and we're just constructing a for loop that's going to repeat 6 times because we're taking line 0, which is 6, converting it into an integer and repeating it 6 times. And then we do the proper notation, and we're going to repeat something 6 times, and we want to output this, whatever is over here. It could be blue, it could be red. In this case, it's red, so obviously we can't just put red like this because we never know what the user is going to put. So to access whatever is inside of there, you have to do line 1, and it automatically converts it to a string, so you don't need to convert it and do anything with that. And that's basically it. However, you might realize like this does not look pretty. Like it really looks kind of confusing, and it just doesn't really look good, and you can imagine it's just going to get more complicated if you forget things or if you wanted to share this code with someone else, which is why you always need to use variables. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this code, but it's better to use variables and store these values, store line 0, line 1, into something else. And that's basically what we're going to do here. So I'm going to create a variable called repeats, and then I'm going to store the line 0 in that. And that way you don't have to put this whole thing in the for loop, you can just do in range repeats. And then you can also create another variable called color, and you can make that line 1, and then you just have to print the color. So now the for loop looks really like a lot more neat, so it's way better this way. And once again, you don't have to do separate input, you can do 6 red, it's going to repeat 6 times. However, at other times, you may not know how many input is going to be on one single line. You won't know what the user is actually going to put. Before, we only had 2 inputs on the same line. We had the number and the color. However, if you wanted to find out how many inputs there are in one line, or how long that array is, that's what we call that type of input, an array, well, you can do something like this with len, and then the name of the actual array. In this case, the variable we called it was line, and len line will tell you how many inputs there are. So you can just print line. It's going to be an integer, but you can still print it regardless. And we just put 4, 5, 6, 7. It prints out 4 because there are 1, 2, 3, 4 inputs. So you can see there's a bunch of neat things you'll be able to do with this. For example, you can iterate through each of those inputs and do something with those inputs. If you did len line like this. However, as good notation notes, if you wanted to maybe print, hello for however many things are in that line, you can do this. And now you would have something like if you did 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you have 5 inputs, it prints out hello 5 different times. Now, you can also, granted, do, as with good exercises, is the number. You can put in a variable called number and then store len line in that. And then you just replace this with number. And another neat thing you can do is if you wanted to print those specific numbers each at a time, you can use, specifically in this for loop, you would realize this is where the I comes in play. You'd be able to do line I, and you'd be able to print line I. They might be wondering, well, what the heck does that mean? Like, what is line I? Well, basically, it's an index, but it's not exactly a number, it's a variable. Every time you're in a for loop, you're creating a new variable called I, and you're changing it every single time you iterate through it. If I starts at 0, then once it repeats it, it changes and turns to 1. Then it repeats, goes to 2, 3, 4, up until the range of number, which is 5. So it goes from 0 to 5. Or not necessarily 0 to 5, but 0 to 4. So if I had 5 different stuff in it, like the number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the index values would be 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I would start off at 0, then it would go to 1, then it would go to 2, then it would go to 3, then it would go to 4, and that's the last one. I is the index. So you can use that to print each of the numbers in the array and reference them constantly. So obviously I should have deleted this, but you run module and for example you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It prints out each of those numbers, which is really cool. Alright, so here is your homework. It's going to be a bit complicated, but I think you guys can do it. It's a bit hard to understand, but let me break it down to you. The first line of input is going to be a list of either 2 to 10 integers on one line. So that's the range of how many integers are going to be on one line. There can be like 2 numbers, or there can be maximum of 10 numbers. Then there's going to be a second line of input, which will basically be a number or an index value that is in the range of the first input. So what this means is, for example, if you look at the first sample input, you have the number 1, 6, 7, and 8. That's 4 lines, which is in between the numbers 2 and 10. Our second one is the number 2, which is going to act as an index value. What do we mean by that? Well, when you see the first line of output, the first line of output is the value of the integer that is at the user's desired index. So remember, the second input is the user's desired index. This is the number they want to be outputted from this list above. So in this situation, the 1 is at index 0, the 6 is at index 1, and the 7 is at index 2. Since the user selected the 2, the output will have to be 7 because 7 is at the second index. Similarly over here, the user selected index 4, so the 5 is at 0, the 10 is at 1, the 20 is at 2, the 30 is at 3, and the 15 is at 4, so you'd have to output the 15. So that's basically what we mean by the index value. You're going to have to look into this first line and get that specific number, value. Then the second line of output is going to be the sum of all the integers in the first line of input. So this really has nothing to do with the second line of input. Really all you have to do is just get the sum of all these numbers. So 1 plus 6 plus 7 plus 8 is 22, so you'd have to output 22. Similarly here, the sum of all these numbers is 100, so you would output 100. Now here are some hints at the bottom. You'd have to use line and you'd have to use n. Obviously you can name these whatever you want, but really you only need to split the first line to get all the individual numbers. And the second line doesn't have to be split because it's just going to be one number or one index. Another hint is to actually get that specific index's value, you're going to have to use the line and then the parentheses, and you're going to want to put some number, whether it's 3 or I or something. You will probably figure it out shortly. So what exactly do you put in there? That's what you have to figure out. And then after this, for the second part, you would have to iterate through each number. If you want to get the sum, you have to iterate through each number in the list and add it to a variable that originally started at 0. So this variable would be outside of some sort of for loop that you have that iterates through each number in the list. And then as you go through each iteration, you're going to take whatever value you have and you're going to add it to this variable and keep adding it, keep adding it, keep adding it until you go through each single number. So it sounds a bit difficult, and if you guys ever need any help, feel free to email us. That's it for today's lesson, and we'll see you guys later. Thank you.